Hello and welcome to Art with Tracy Anne. This week we'll be looking at how to use watercolor pencils. I'll be showing you lots of tips and techniques to get the most out of your watercolor pencils. Before we even start with the watercolors, make sure that the pens you're using are waterproof. You don't want your ink to smudge when you've spent all that time with your artwork. I have a couple of pencils from Zentangle project packs, plus some I've had for a long time, and I've chosen just the blues and greens for this project. When you sharpen your pencils, keep the coloured part for later. I'm using an ice cube tray, and put that aside, and I'll show you what we'll do with that later in this video. On the first part of this project, I'll be using some masking fluid. So I've got this angle chisel colour shaper to apply the masking fluid. You can use a paintbrush, but use an old one. You don't want to wreck a good paintbrush. I've poured some of the masking fluid into a small container, and you can see I've drawn the pattern Shattuck with a pencil, and I'm just carefully applying the masking fluid over the pencil lines. You don't need to use pencil, but I planned out where the pattern will go. Pencil lines will disappear when we remove the masking fluid. I'm using one of the Opus tiles that you can purchase from Zentangle's official website. Ideally, you'd probably be using watercolor paper, but I find the Zentangle official tiles are 100% cotton and they hold water pretty well. They're also a nice thick piece of card. I'll skip ahead now, and this is what it looks like when it's finished. So we'll leave that to dry. On a scrap piece of watercolor paper, I'll show you how to do a gradient using just one color. For my gradient, I press heavily at one end and gradually fade out by pressing much lighter. When you activate the paint, start adding water from the light end into the dark. That way you get a nice gradient. If we start painting from the darker end, the paintbrush pushes that pigment along the gradient, then we end up with just one solid block of colour. I'm going to use this technique on my Muka pattern. I'm just adding a very faint bit of shading with one light blue colour. Because I want this pattern a fairly washed out colour, in parts when I activate it, I'll have to end up drawing some of that pigment into the part where I haven't actually coloured. Even though you can't see much of the paint here, I can always go back in later and add a little bit more colour. Another way of achieving a gradient is by blending colours. Here I'm using a light blue, and then I'm going to gradually change that to a dark blue, and as I add the colouring, I'm going to overlap the two colours slightly. Again, when you activate the paint, start from the lighter colour into the dark colour. If you start painting the darker colour first, you'll find that once that water activates the paint, the darker colour will overpower the lighter one. On this tile, I'll show you how you can blend two different colours. On the poke root design, I'm adding a red to the outer part of that berry, and then on the inside I'll add a little bit of blue. To blend these colours, I'll just slightly overlap the two colours. For the poke leaf pattern, I'm using a light green on the outer part of the leaf and then a darker green on the inside. To blend the two colours on the berries, I'm starting with the red first. I don't want the blue to overpower the red, so once I've finished painting the red, I can do the blue, and then I can always draw that blue colour up into the red if I want it to blend better. You can see that I'm now using a water brush. I still keep a paper towel and some water handy so that I can clean off the brush before switching colours. So with the leaf, I'll start with the light green and gradually work my way down into the darker green. Again, I can play around with that colour afterwards, drawing it up and blending it however I need to. And there's our finished simple little tile. Back to today's project, and I'm using colour blending in the flux at the centre of our tile. I'm using a light blue at the outer part of this pattern, and gradually I'll blend that down into a darker blue in the centre. I'm using a third blue to blend these two colours. To add a little bit more interest to this colour, I'll put a bit of light green into the light blue and then add a dark green down into those darker blues. Again, when I activate the colour, I'll start painting from the lighter colours down into the darker ones. Then I can draw the darker colours up into that leaf shape however I want them to sit. If they come up too far, I can always clean my paintbrush and come from the lighter end back down into the darker again. Just be careful you don't work this area too much because we don't want to damage the surface of the paper. Whenever we're blending colours, it's really important to know how colours mix together. When we mix our three primary colours, red, yellow and blue, we end up with brown. And unless we plan on brown, we don't want our painting to look muddy. So if we mix green, which is made up of yellow and blue, with purple, which involves red, or orange, which also involves red, we're going to get brown. You can get away with mixing these colours with traditional pencils, but when you use watercolour, you'll end up with mud. The masking fluid is dry now, so I'll work on this area. I'm starting with a light blue, and I'm going to gradually go down into that semicircle shape, down into a darker blue. When you're colouring these areas, be careful not to disturb the masking fluid. We don't want that peeling off just yet. And I'm adding quite a lot of pigment by pressing hard with the pencil. Once we've got those colours down, I can gradually overlap them a little bit. Now we'll activate those colours using our paintbrush, again starting from the light going down into the dark. It really doesn't matter that you get paint on the masking fluid. I'll turn my page here, it'll be actually easier to push those colours down into the darker ones. I apologise for the shaky table. I only realised that after hours of filming, so I promise I'll never use this table in future videos. Now that's done, I'll move back into the centre of my tile, and I'm colouring those orbs with light green and dark green shadow around them, then colouring the centre orbs in the dark green. Now activate those orbs with a paintbrush. I'm using a dark blue now for that outer circle, and I'm pressing quite hard because I want the colour to be very saturated. And use water to activate that colour. The paint on the outer border is now dry, so we can pull off that masking fluid. I'm just using my finger to gently peel back the masking fluid, and as it comes off, I can see that it's taking away the pencil lines with it. If you were wondering what we're going to do with the pencil shavings, we're just going to add some water and make a little paint palette. Once we've finished painting with these paints and they dry out, we can save them for another day because we only need to add water to reactivate them again. It's a great way of getting the most out of your watercolour pencils. Now with just plain water on our brush, mine looks blue because my water container is blue, but that doesn't matter, you can see where I'm painting. I'm going to use the wet on wet technique. I'm just going to concentrate on one small area at a time because I don't want the paper to dry out. Now that I've wet that section, I'm just going to drop in some of the colours from our palette that we've just made. See how the paint spreads into that wet background. While that is still wet, I'm just going to sprinkle some rock salt in random areas. As you can see, I finished that inner square and also did the same effect on the outer border. I'll just let that paint dry before we remove the salt. And there it is. Gives quite a textured effect. Another way of creating a palette is by using a piece of scrap watercolor paper. We can scribble on it using our watercolor pencils and then activate that paint using our water and brush to pick up that pigment to paint on our piece. I'm going to use this paint now to touch up the muka and add a little bit more depth of colour to it. Another way of adding a little bit of extra colour is directly from the pencil. Just wet our paintbrush and there we go. We can paint it directly onto our page. Add a bit more water. It's not showing up too much, so I might use a darker pencil here. Another technique we can use to create texture is a paint splatter effect. So we take the paint from the pencil and then just gently tap that paintbrush onto the pencil and splatter onto the page. Now that my project is all dry and finished, I'll just touch up the outline with a black micron pen. And there's the finished results. I hope you got a lot out of that video and it's inspired you to use your watercolor pencils. Next week I'll be talking all about composition, so join me then. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out, and have a great week. Until next week, bye for now. If you'd like to see more of my videos, click on the links on the screen and don't forget, hit the subscribe button.